For most civilizations, love was sacred, an act of connection, warmth, and life. But in Sparta, love was irrelevant. Sex wasn't passion, it was policy. The human body was nothing more than state property, a vessel to forge the next generation of killers. Desire was replaced by decree, reproduction became warfare. The Spartans weren't born as individuals, they were manufactured as weapons. Their city was an ancient factory of flesh, a machine that decided who would live, who would die, and who would be molded into the perfect soldier. Behind the legends of the 300 lies a truth far more savage than heroism, a cold program of selective breeding that erased the concept of family itself. To be born in Sparta was to belong to the state, to be loved meant to be strong, and to be weak meant death. This is not mythology. This is how an empire engineered perfection through cruelty, and how its obsession with strength destroyed it from within. In the rugged valleys of Laconia, far from the luxuries of Athens or the poetry of Corinth, a different kind of civilization was built. Sparta was not a city born for beauty or art, it was designed for endurance, discipline, and control. Every brick, every law, every heartbeat served a singular purpose, to sustain a nation perpetually prepared for war. This vision began not on the battlefield but in the most intimate act of human existence, birth. The Spartans believed that the strength of their army began long before a child learned to hold a shield. It began the moment a man and woman were chosen to create life. But unlike the rest of Greece, Sparta did not leave that choice to passion or affection. The state itself decided who could breed, when, and why. The Spartans saw human emotion as a liability. Love, jealousy, or personal attachment could fracture the unity of the state. To them, every citizen existed only as a part of a greater organism, the body of Sparta. Marriage was stripped of romance and transformed into an instrument of the state's survival. The government, ruled by elders hardened from decades of war, acted as the supreme matchmaker. Men were inspected like livestock, their shoulders measured, their lineage traced, their physical endurance tested. Women, too, were evaluated not for charm or wit, but for health, symmetry, and strength. The union of two people was treated as a calculation, a breeding formula to engineer the ideal warrior. Every pairing had to contribute to the perfection of the bloodline. In these cold rituals, the concept of choice dissolved. A young Spartan might be ordered to marry a woman he barely knew, not because he desired her, but because their union promised healthy offspring. And the woman, trained from childhood to view her body as a tool for the state, accepted this command without protest. She was raised not to dream of love or home, but to understand that her womb was an extension of Sparta's will. In their minds, producing a strong child was the highest form of patriotism. Their identity was fused with duty, their worth measured in the strength of the sons they bore. This philosophy of breeding became the foundation of what historians would later call state eugenics. Centuries before the modern world would coin the term, Sparta had already mastered the practice. To them, every birth was a military operation, every child a potential soldier in training. The weak had no place in their system. Every life had to justify its existence through strength. Compassion was seen as indulgence, and mercy as weakness. This was not cruelty for pleasure. It was cold logic, an unfeeling belief that only through perfect discipline could Sparta endure against the endless enemy surrounding its borders. Behind the legend of the fearless 300 stood this grim machinery, an invisible system of control that reached into the bedroom and beyond. The state owned the bodies of its citizens. Men belonged to the barracks, women to the breeding chambers, and children to the army. Every kiss, every birth, every drop of blood was a contribution to the machine. Those who resisted the system, who refused to marry or reproduce, were marked as traitors to their own people. The city could not afford individual rebellion. In Sparta, love was a battlefield of its own, one where emotion was the enemy and obedience the only victory. By the time a Spartan child was conceived, its fate was already decided. The parents had fulfilled their function, the state would decide the rest. And thus began the savage cycle of creation that would define Sparta for centuries, a civilization that sought to breed perfection and, in the process, erased everything human about itself. From the moment a Spartan girl could walk, her purpose was decided not by her heart, but by her body. She belonged to the state long before she ever belonged to herself. While other Greek cities cloistered their daughters in silence, spinning wool or learning modesty, Sparta turned its girls into instruments of biological warfare. They were trained not for charm, but for childbirth. The city believed that strong women produced strong sons, and so their upbringing resembled that of soldiers. They ran through open fields, hurled javelins, wrestled under the sun, and learned to endure pain without tears. Their muscles were not ornaments but assets, their endurance a national resource. The state needed mothers who could survive difficult births and produce warriors without flaw. From adolescence, they were told their battlefield would not be on the plains of Thermopylae, but in the agony of labor. Their glory was not measured by victory in combat, but by the sons they offered to Sparta's cause. In this twisted philosophy, femininity was rewritten as function. Marriage was no romantic milestone, it was a command. A woman's worth was weighed in the strength of her children, and barrenness was treated like treason. If a wife failed to conceive, the state intervened. Magistrates and elders would inspect the couple, not with compassion but calculation. If the fault was found in the husband, arrangements were made for another man, often a younger and stronger warrior, to impregnate the woman. This act was neither shameful nor secret. It was civic duty disguised as necessity. Fidelity, the sacred bond between man and wife, was shattered under the iron logic of the law. The womb was a public institution, a tool to refine the bloodline. Husbands consented, not out of affection, but because the birth of a strong child elevated the entire household's honor. Adultery ceased to exist in Sparta, for the very concept of personal ownership of the body was erased. Every man and woman belonged to the greater machine of survival. The irony was that this system, built on control, created a strange equality between men and women. Spartan women commanded a level of respect unknown in the rest of Greece. They were not confined to domestic roles or treated as ornaments. They spoke boldly, managed estates, and even owned land while their husbands lived in barracks. Yet this freedom was not liberation, it was conscription by another name. They were not free to follow their own desires, but free to better serve the state's reproductive ambitions. Strength was demanded, not requested. Discipline was expected, not admired. Their bodies were monuments of national pride, sculpted by the same ideology that stripped them of individuality. To fail in their duty was to betray the homeland, and betrayal was unforgivable. Even their rituals of marriage reflected the cold precision of the Spartan system. There was no ceremony of love, no vows exchanged beneath the gods. Instead, a chilling rite of abduction symbolized the transition from girl to breeder. The bride's hair was shaved, her femininity erased, her body cloaked in a man's tunic. She was left waiting in darkness until her chosen husband came secretly in the night. Their encounter was brief, wordless, and efficient, a calculated act of conception rather than intimacy. By dawn, he would return to his barracks, leaving her alone in silence. For years, they would meet only in secrecy, their relationship hidden from the world, as though even affection itself were forbidden to bloom. Through such measures, Sparta erased the boundary between love and labor, turning every union into an extension of its military code. Pleasure, tenderness, and sentiment were considered weaknesses that could fracture discipline. The body existed to serve the collective, not the self. What began as the most natural of human acts, creation, had been reduced to an assembly line of flesh and will. Beneath the glory of Spartan legend lay this quiet horror, a world where even the miracle of birth was stripped of its humanity, and the cries of newborns echoed not with joy, but with the cold approval of the state. When the cries of a newborn echoed through the stone streets of Sparta, they did not summon tenderness or celebration. In any other land, the birth of a child was a sacred moment, an offering to the gods of life. In Sparta, it was a test, the child's first and perhaps final trial. The midwife did not place the baby into its mother's arms, for the mother's will was irrelevant. Instead, the infant was taken away almost immediately to a grim place known as the Lesh, the Hall of Judgment. There, beneath the cold gaze of the Gerousia, a council of elder warriors scarred by decades of war, the inspection began. These men, who had witnessed death on every field and conquered their own fear through cruelty, served as the first arbiters of life. They examined the newborn as one might inspect a weapon, calculating, silent, precise. They studied the child's limbs, its spine, its cry, and even its heartbeat. Strength meant survival. Imperfection meant disposal. To the modern mind, this judgment seems monstrous, but to the Spartans it was logic purified. They believed that compassion for weakness was a luxury they could not afford. Surrounded by enemies, outnumbered by their enslaved Helot population, they saw mercy as a dagger aimed at the heart of their nation. A frail child was not an individual tragedy but a collective risk. If one generation allowed softness, the next could be enslaved. Thus, they turned survival into ritual and cruelty into law. When a child passed inspection, it was returned to its family, not as a son, but as property of the state, a future soldier already bound to its destiny. But when the verdict was failure, the outcome was chillingly simple. The infant was carried beyond the city, up the barren slopes of Mount Taygetus, to a pit known as the Apothetai. There, beneath the indifferent sky, the unfit were left to die in the cold. No mourning was permitted, for grief was weakness. The mother's tears were seen as betrayal. The elders insisted this was not murder but purification, an act of returning imperfection to the earth. In their eyes, nature itself was a ruthless general, and they were merely following its command. To reject weakness was to protect strength. To extinguish one fragile life was to secure 1,000. It was a philosophy so absolute that it consumed all humanity within it. Yet to those who survived the inspection, existence offered no mercy. Life in Sparta was a prolonged campaign of preparation, beginning from the moment a child drew breath. At the age of 7, every boy was torn from his mother's arms and delivered to the barracks of the agoge, the most brutal educational system ever conceived by man. The state did not simply wish to train soldiers, it sought to manufacture perfection, to mold human instinct into disciplined machinery. Childhood, laughter, innocence, all were extinguished the instant a boy crossed those gates. The agoge stripped each child of individuality. They were taught to sleep on beds made from reeds torn with bare hands from the riverbanks, to wear the same rough cloak through the searing summers and the freezing winters, and to survive on half rations designed to keep them permanently hungry. The deprivation was deliberate, a cruel form of arithmetic. The body that could not adapt to pain was the body unfit for war. Theft was encouraged as long as it went unseen, for the act of stealing demanded stealth and cunning. If caught, the punishment was not for the theft, but for the failure. Every lash of the whip imprinted the lesson that success justified any action, while failure erased every virtue. To stumble meant disgrace, and disgrace was worse than death. Through hunger, pain, and fear, the boys learned the code of the warrior: never to cry, never to complain, and never to yield. They were transformed from sons into instruments, from children into shadows of the state's will. By the time they emerged as men, they no longer remembered the warmth of affection or the sound of comfort. Their hearts were iron, their loyalty absolute. This was how Sparta built its perfect warriors, not by raising them, but by breaking them, piece by piece, until only obedience remained. The agoge did not stop at mastering the body. Its true purpose was to conquer the mind. Spartan instructors understood that the flesh could be hardened with hunger and pain, but true perfection required the annihilation of fear, doubt, and individuality. From dawn until dusk, boys were trained not merely to fight, but to obey without hesitation, to silence the voice of emotion that whispered of comfort, mercy, or rebellion. Words were controlled like weapons. Speaking without purpose was punished, and silence became the highest virtue. The region of Laconia gave birth to the word laconic, brief, cold, stripped of decoration, and this was no coincidence. Children were taught that speech should cut like a blade, that hesitation or sentiment were signs of weakness. Even conversation became a battlefield, each phrase measured, each answer demanded to be sharp and fearless. When they failed to respond with precision, their instructors bit their hands or struck them with rods, not out of anger but as a lesson. Pain was the only language that truly disciplined the soul. But the agoge's cruelty did not rest solely in the hands of teachers. The state created an entire hierarchy of torment, where older boys ruled over the younger with absolute authority. These youths, called Arenes, were both mentors and executioners, charged with testing, humiliating, and molding their subordinates. They forced them to fight for scraps of food, to endure the lash without flinching, to answer complex questions under duress. A single mistake, a stutter, a misplaced word, a tremor in the voice, could summon a storm of blows. This cruelty was deliberate. It taught hierarchy, endurance, and deceit. The weak learned to hide behind masks, the strong learned to dominate, and all learned that suffering was the language of power. Compassion became a forgotten concept, replaced by suspicion and competition. Each boy was both victim and tormentor, shaped by violence until he no longer distinguished pain from pride. This unrelenting discipline culminated in the most horrific of all Spartan rites, the ordeal at the altar of Artemis Orthia. Each year, young boys were driven toward the goddess's shrine, where offerings of cheese were placed upon the sacred stone. To claim them, the boys had to sprint through a gauntlet of whips wielded by older warriors. Leather cracked through the air, slicing open skin, painting the altar with blood. It was not a contest of speed, but of silence. The purpose was not victory but endurance, to stand unmoving beneath agony, to bleed without crying out, to smile as the flesh tore. Those who screamed were disgraced. Those who died without flinching were celebrated. Plutarch wrote of children collapsing at the altar, their faces serene even as life drained from them, their final breath a whisper of pride for Sparta. In this ritual, pain became sanctified, suffering became worship, and death itself was transformed into triumph. Yet the most chilling transformation awaited the survivors when they reached adulthood. The city demanded proof that their obedience extended beyond training, beyond discipline, into the realm of morality itself. That proof came through the Cryptia, a secret order of young men chosen from the Agogis's finest. Their task was not combat, but extermination. Each year, the ephors, Sparta's ruling magistrates, declared a symbolic war on their own enslaved population, the helots. This declaration made murder lawful, turning slaughter into civic duty. Under the cover of darkness, the chosen warriors were sent into the countryside armed only with daggers, commanded to hunt and kill the boldest or most defiant helots. They were not soldiers, they were executioners, ghosts in the night whose purpose was to instill terror and eliminate potential rebellion. For the state, this was the final examination, not of strength or skill, but of conscience. Could a man kill without anger, without hesitation, without guilt? Only then was he considered complete, a perfect instrument of the law. Those who survived the Cryptia emerged hollowed, stripped of empathy, remade into creatures of obedience. The transformation was irreversible. They no longer fought for themselves or for honor. They fought because the state commanded it. In them, Sparta's dream reached its purest form, men without hearts, bound by fear and forged by devotion. And yet, in the perfection of their loyalty, the seeds of the city's destruction had already begun to take root. When the final generation of warriors emerged from the Agoga, Sparta stood unmatched. Its soldiers were the envy and terror of Greece, men of stone who could march through fire without fear and meet death with calm eyes. The system had achieved what it was designed to create, human weapons without hesitation or remorse. Yet beneath this iron discipline lay a quiet rot, one born not from foreign enemies but from within their own walls. Perfection, once achieved, became poison. The same ideology that had made them invincible also made them fragile. The strict breeding codes that prized strength and purity had narrowed their bloodlines so severely that each loss on the battlefield became a wound that the nation could not heal. Every fallen warrior represented not just the death of a soldier, but the extinction of a lineage. Generations of selective breeding had produced a race of elites too perfect, too few, too rigid to survive the chaos of history. The dream of a flawless human army was devouring itself. As centuries passed, this genetic bottleneck began to manifest in the most ironic of ways. The city that had built its reputation on strength now suffered from decline and infertility. The numbers of true-born Spartans dwindled, while the enslaved helots multiplied beyond control. Fear replaced pride, and tyranny replaced discipline. The rulers clung desperately to their old laws, refusing to adapt, even as the world around them changed. They could not understand that their greatest strength, their refusal to compromise, was now their greatest weakness. Their warriors could recite the codes of Lycurgus with perfect precision, but they could not innovate, could not imagine, could not evolve. The Agoga had created soldiers who could win battles but not build futures. Their rigidity, once their glory, now became their curse. When confronted with the fluid strategies of newer Greek armies and the rise of more cunning minds, the Spartans found themselves trapped in their own perfection. The final blow came at the Battle of Leuctra in 3071 BCE. For generations, Sparta's enemies had trembled at the sight of their red cloaks and bronze shields. But on that day, a single innovation shattered centuries of dominance. The Theban general Epaminondas broke from tradition, stacking his left wing 50 men deep and driving it like a spear straight into the Spartan right. the position of their king and elite guard. The phalanx, once thought unbreakable, crumbled beneath the weight of creativity. The Spartan line, designed for symmetry and order, could not withstand chaos. When their king fell, so too did the illusion of their invincibility. The battlefield that had once been their sanctuary became their graveyard. Hundreds of their finest perished, and with them the fragile genetic web that held their society together unraveled. In that single day, the machine of perfection finally cracked, revealing the frailty beneath the armor. In the centuries that followed, Sparta became a ghost of itself. The city that once ruled Greece with iron will turned into a living museum, its customs reenacted for foreign spectators like actors performing an old tragedy. Its men still trained, its women still spoke of honor and strength, but the spark that had once fueled their empire had burned itself out. The obsession with breeding the perfect warrior had cost them everything human: love, compassion, imagination, and ultimately survival. What remained was silence, a civilization that had conquered weakness so thoroughly that it eradicated its own humanity. Their legacy was not greatness but warning, proof that a society can forge perfection and, in the same breath, extinguish its soul. The story of Sparta's savage breeding practices is not merely history, it is prophecy. It speaks of what happens when a people trade empathy for efficiency, when a culture seeks to manufacture greatness rather than nurture it. Sparta's fall reminds us that no empire, however strong, can outlive its own cruelty. For in the pursuit of perfection, they created the one thing they feared most: extinction. And if you found this glimpse into Sparta's forgotten darkness as haunting as it is fascinating, remember, history's most terrifying lessons are the ones written in blood. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we uncover more hidden truths buried beneath the ruins of time.